Hi, everyone. I'm Vladimir Dutit. We are watching all the news happening in the United States and around the world. Check out these monitors behind me. These are feeds coming into the CBS News Broadcast Center from all of our stations and affiliates around the country. If it's happening out there, we're going to bring it to you live right here in Studio 55. Let's begin. China strikes back with retaliatory actions moments after President Trump's tariffs took effect, what it all means for American companies and critical goods. Plus, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is at the White House today. What we know about their meeting and scheduled press conference, which happens later this afternoon. And unprecedented levels of turmoil inside the FBI as agents fear a purge is on the horizon. We're going to have details about the Justice Department's probe of the agency coming up ahead. This is CBS News 24/7. All right, China is fighting back against the Trump administration's tariffs on Chinese products. Beijing is planning to slap tariffs on multiple U.S. imports. The move is mirroring that trade war between the United States and China, which happened back in 2018, which could cause a ripple effect on the U.S. economy. Now, this comes almost less than 24 hours after the United States paused its tariffs that it had planned to impose on Canada and Mexico. So let's bring in CBS News Money Watch correspondent Kelly O'Grady to break this all down for us. So let's begin first with China. It's interesting, and I think we were talking about this on CBS Mornings yesterday, that the United States had planned to put higher tariffs on our allies, Canada, Mexico, and lower tariffs on China. Meanwhile, he just rescinded, or at least he paused those tariffs on our allies. He kept the tariffs in place in China. What's going on?
Yeah, fast-moving situation. So I think what's interesting is he placed a 10% tariff on all Chinese imports. That's much less than the 60% or the 100% that he had at one point threatened, and as you said, much less than 25%. What China did in response is a little bit muted, and I really want to emphasize that. They put a 15% tariff on liquefied natural gas and coal, a 10% tariff on crude oil, farming equipment, and cars coming from the U.S. That's not a ton that they import from us, okay? They get much more of those types of products from Russia, from Indonesia. Also, the U.S. doesn't export a ton of those products to China. So it was sort of a little bit of a tariff versus what we could have done on China. And then China's response was a bit muted. Now, in terms of what you're going to see in terms of prices in the U.S., you're not going to see a full 10% increase when you go to the store and you buy a toy that came from China, because that 10% tax, import tax, is paid by the company, but it's on a wholesale price. And then they can decide if they're going to pass all of that on to you. So it's not going to see, if you buy a $100 item, a $110 price tag for you. It's going to be a little bit less. But what I find interesting, Vlad, is this was tit for tat, but it was definitely muted on both sides.
So it almost feels as if China is like, this is Sparta. Like, you're not going to threaten me. To get that reference, right?
Yes.
It's like a pop culture reference. I'm a pop culture nerd, but it almost feels as if they're like, look, go ahead and do it. We're fine. We're not going to be affected by this. If you keep coming at us, we will find more creative ways to come after the United States.
Potentially, though. The other aspect is I want to remind us all where China's economy is right now. They're not doing so great after the pandemic. They didn't have as much of a resurgence as the U.S. did. So they also want to be careful that they want to signal to the U.S. this is Sparta, but they also don't want to hurt their economy too much. And I want to note they didn't put import taxes on key rare minerals and whatnot that they need for their semiconductor industry. Remember, they want to build high-powered chips, and they don't want to hamstring them. So it was, yes, I'm signaling don't come at us, but I also don't want to hurt my economy that is in a little bit of a tough place right now.
It's really kind of fascinating when you think about it on a geopolitical level, because as we're talking about it, it sort of signals that China is calling President Trump's bluff. You can try to do this. It may look good back home. It doesn't really affect us at the levels that you expect that it will affect us. And remember, as we've been pointing out to our viewers, any tariffs that are imposed on another country are paid by the country where those goods are coming into, which would be the United States. So it'll be really interesting to see how it all sort of plays out over the next couple of weeks, and if President Trump decides to increase the level of tariffs on China. Really fascinating discussion, Kelly. Always great to have you here in the studio. Thanks so much. Appreciate it. All right, let's bring in CBS News correspondent Natalie Brand, who joins us from the White House to talk more about Mexico and Canada, which, Natalie, as you know, made those last-minute deals Some are calling it deals. The president is calling it a deal to postpone the tariff threat. So first, let's talk about what the president is saying, and then let's talk about the reality on the ground.
Vlad, good to be with you. Yeah, the White House touting this as a win as the leaders of Mexico and Canada promised some increased security around the border. Mexico's President Sheinbaum promising 10,000 National Guard troops there as, you know, the White House really threatened these tariffs to try to elicit more action in terms of curbing the flow of illegal migrants and drugs. But we do know, Vlad, that Mexico had really begun beefing up enforcement around the border last year, even under the Biden administration, putting troops on the border to try to, again, address what had been, you know, unprecedented levels of migration. That situation has really tamped down in recent months, even before President Trump took office. As for Canada and its announcement, additional frontline personnel, technology, a commitment to appoint a fentanyl czar, some new initiatives, but also initiatives that had been previously announced months ago. So some experts are seeing the concessions here as not as much, but we'll have to wait and see what happens over the next 30 days. That is the period of time during which the tariffs are on pause for now. As for those tariffs on China that you were just talking about with Kelly, I spoke to a former deputy chief economist at the State Department under the Biden administration, Philip Luck, and asked him what he expects from the negotiations between the U.S. and China. We know President Trump is expected to soon talk to Chinese President Xi as early as today, potentially. So I asked him, what is he expecting from those conversations? Could there be a compromise there?
Tariffs on Canada and Mexico would have been dramatically economically impactful. They would have raised costs to U.S. consumers by what was estimated to more than about $1,500 per family per year. These tariffs will be impactful. They will raise prices. We will pay most of them. But they will not be as impactful as the tariffs on Canada and Mexico would have been.
And Philip Luck there raised the question, which other experts are raising as well. The threat of tariffs or imposition of tariffs, is this the administration trying to change trade policy with respect to these countries, or is it being used as a tool, a leverage in a negotiation, Vlad?
Yeah, it's really fascinating. I know the White House is signaling when it comes to Mexico that it's a win, but the reporting from us and other news organizations is that the Mexican government had already promised President Joe Biden to send some 15,000 troops to the border back in 2021. They also did it back in 2019 when President Trump threatened tariffs at that time to Mexico. So it's not exactly clear, other than the president being able to say that he's got to win, that anything is going to change on the Mexican side, because they already have, as you say, Natalie, those troops on the border. So let's talk now about what's happening at the White House this afternoon with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu.
Yeah, this will be the first joint press conference with a foreign leader. The fact that it's Israel's prime minister, both countries saying that signals the significance of this relationship, an extremely close relationship between these two leaders and countries. And it comes at a really critical time when the Trump administration will have to continue to mediate and help negotiate this phase 2 of the very fragile ceasefire deal between Israel and Hamas. Phase 2 is when there's hope that all the Israeli hostages will be released, and there's more a definitive answer as to how this war ends and what happens in Gaza. That is a big question. The future of Gaza, what happens to the Palestinian people, that is what these leaders, some of the questions they will be asked today.
All right, we'll be watching. Natalie Brand for us. Thank you very much. For more on President Trump's meeting with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, I want to bring in CBS News foreign correspondent Chris Livesay. All right, Chris, so one of the things that I think will be very interesting is what Israel is especially looking to get out of this visit, given that this fragile ceasefire between the Israelis and Hamas is holding firm as of now. But as you know, Chris, there's been what people are calling a Fedpocalypse here in the United States, specifically in Washington, as the Trump administration looks to do things very, very differently than has been done in years past. And I wonder how that will play out diplomatically during this meeting.
Yeah, well, it's indeed a very, very fragile ceasefire. I think the thing that the Netanyahu administration is trying to get out of this meeting more than anything else is pressure on Hamas to release more of the hostages and to, keep this ceasefire going. Remember that before Donald Trump even took office, he came out with that threat to all hell break loose if there weren't hostages released before he came into office. And now here we are, he's in office, and we're seeing those hostages starting to come out in exchange for Palestinian prisoners. Now, bear in mind, this is a deal that took months and months of negotiations on the part of the Biden administration, but it had also stalled for months and months. So the Netanyahu team is trying to get as much as it possibly can out of that support from President Trump.
All right, so Hamas, Chris, as you know, says that talks on negotiating the second phase of this ceasefire deal have now begun. What are some of the hurdles that both sides are going to need to overcome to keep this deal going?
There are a lot of hurdles. So just to name a few, Hamas wants a permanent ceasefire. They don't want the temporary pause that we're witnessing right now. They want guarantees that Israel won't restart military operations. However, Israel doesn't want to agree to that unless Hamas is completely dismantled. Israel also wants to keep security control. Even if there's a ceasefire, Israel wants to make sure Hamas doesn't rearm. And that means maintaining military oversight, which Hamas and its allies reject. And finally, who governs Gaza after the war? There is still no clear plan for what happens next. Israel definitely doesn't want Hamas in power, but they also don't have an alternative government ready to take over.
All right, Chris Livesay for us in Tel Aviv. Chris, thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Vlad.
Lawmakers on Capitol Hill are expected to hold some critical votes today on two of President Trump's cabinet picks, Director of National Intelligence nominee Tulsi Gabbard and Health and Human Services nominee RFK Jr. Both faced some very contentious hearings last week. Now the committees that held those hearings will decide whether they will advance. Let's get right to CBS News senior congressional correspondent Nicole Killian to talk more about this. So Nicole, as you know, Louisiana Republican Bill Cassidy had this tense exchange with Robert Kennedy Jr. over the issue of vaccines. Some thought that he might be not willing to support this nomination, but has he given any indication as how he might vote?
Yeah, well, I don't know if you caught that moment just as you were tossing to me, Vlad, but literally Senator Cassidy just walked out of his office. I asked him how he plans to vote. He still will not disclose that, but he did tell me that he has made a decision about the nomination of Robert F. Kennedy Jr. The Senate Finance Committee just gavelled in, so we expect to hear him potentially reveal that decision as the committee prepares to take a vote on his nomination. But certainly this has been a difficult decision for the Louisiana Republican, who is a physician and who questioned, as you mentioned, Kennedy extensively about his views about vaccines, even telling the story about when he was a doctor and having to deal with a patient who, was very ill for not taking a vaccine. So that was a very difficult situation and one in which he expressed his views as to why he believes vaccines are important, but he tried to push Kennedy on that to say that they are safe, and the nominee simply did not do that. So we do know that Senator Cassidy has had some conversations with RFK Jr. over the weekend ahead of this vote, and we'll have to see how those deliberations and those conversations play out as the Senate Finance Committee prepares to take its vote.
Yeah, it's sort of interesting, and I wonder what some of Senator Cassidy's constituents would think about a medical doctor who would support a nominee who believed that somehow vaccines caused autism, when clearly it doesn't appear that Senator Kennedy, the senator himself, Cassidy, believes that vaccines cause autism. So, what are you hearing from others on the Hill about? I guess the question would be for Democrats about what they think about that.
Yeah, well, just to follow up on your point with respect to the senator, I mean, I would also note that he is going to be up for re-election next year, and so there's also this political dynamic at play. And also keep in mind that this is someone who isn't necessarily or hasn't necessarily been a staunch supporter of the president. While he has said that he certainly supports his policies, he has been at odds with the president, particularly when it came to his last impeachment in the Senate. So from that standpoint, he is someone who is willing to go against the grain, but at the same time, Senate Republicans are very aware of the fact that they do have this mandate in light of the election, that they do want to help the president advance his agenda, which also includes advancing his nominees.
You make an excellent point, Nicole, when you remind our viewers that Senator Cassidy is up for re-election. And let's see how it plays out. Re-election campaign, Hippocratic Oath, we'll see. Let me ask you, if he were to vote against RFK Jr., what would that mean for his nomination? In other words, where does the count look like right now?
Yeah, well, this is going to be a very close vote in committee. Most of these committee votes for many of the president's nominees have come down along party lines, and I expect we could see the same in this committee, simply because if you looked at the line of questioning both in the Senate Finance Committee and Senate Help last week, Democrats in particular by and large were staunchly opposed, and even some said that they would not support RFK Jr.'s nomination, even though at the outset it seemed like some might be willing to support him. So that dynamic did change a little bit when we saw those hearings take place. But that being said, if for some reason his nomination doesn't advance, it doesn't mean that his nomination is dead in the water. It simply makes it a little harder for him, because the committee could recommend that he not be approved, but the Senate could still take up a full floor vote on his nomination, but that would require a higher threshold of votes, 60 votes, rather than just a simple majority.
All right, Nicole Killian for us, breaking it down as only she can on the Hill. Nicole, we'll check back in with you when we have a vote. Thank you. All right, an atmospheric river is bringing heavy rain and snow to parts of the West Coast, which blanketed the Pacific Northwest. Talking snow, and yesterday, that means that more could be on the way for Oregon and Washington in the coming days. Parts of Northern California have seen around 13 inches of rain since the weekend. The National Weather Service has issued flood watches for areas like Sacramento and the Bay Area. So let's bring in CBS News Philadelphia meteorologist Grant Gilmore with the first look at the national forecast. Hi, Grant.
Hey, Vlad, good morning. Look, you talked about these atmospheric rivers. I'll tell you what, it's hard to really understand exactly what that means. It's literally a fire hose of this moisture coming from the Pacific that is all being funneled in a very concentrated location. Just look at that cloud cover streaming in. This goes as far west as Hawaii, and it just gets funneled all the way into the Pacific coast, where they're going to continue to deal with a lot of this moisture over the next couple of days. It comes in the lower elevations as rain, and that's why we have this concern for flash flooding, a slight risk for excessive rainfall across portions of central and northern California, including the Bay Area. But the higher elevations get into a lot of snow. Look at this forecast as we go through the next couple of days, where some places in the higher elevations in the Sierra Nevada could pick up nearly 5 feet of snow, and even some of that moisture, Vlad, will drop south into SoCal. We'll have to watch that in some of the burn scar areas from the wildfires earlier last month. Back to you.
All right, Grant, thank you very much. More wreckage from the fatal D.C. mid-air plane crash is being removed from the Potomac River as investigators find new clues as to what happened. The details are coming up next. You're streaming CBS News 24/7. You're looking at live pictures right now on Capitol Hill, where the Senate Finance Committee is voting on RFK's nomination as Health and Human Service Secretary. We're going to keep an eye on all of the happenings on the Hill, bring you the result of the vote as soon as it happens. Meanwhile, we're also following some breaking news out of Sweden, where police there say 5 people have been shot at an adult education center. Police have surrounded the campus of the school, and they remain at the scene. One media report says the gunman died by suicide. Now, this is happening about 125 miles west of Stockholm, the capital. Our partners at the BBC are following the situation. We're going to check in with them if we get any more details. Let's talk about our friends across the border. Talking Canada and Mexico, those tariffs that the president had threatened will not take effect, at least not for now. Right now, President Trump has issued the pause after speaking with leaders of both countries. CBS News national correspondent Nikki Batiste is live from Detroit. So, Nikki, let's talk about why you are there in Detroit and why the president put a pause on those tariffs.
So President Trump and Prime Minister Justin Trudeau of Canada, just across the border here, had 2 phone calls yesterday. Trudeau ultimately agreeing to deploy new technology and personnel at the border and collectively launch the U.S. and Canada a cooperative to try to fight fentanyl smuggling, money laundering, and organized crime. Again, Trudeau ultimately agreeing to help Trump do what he has wanted to do, protect the borders. And Trudeau said, quote, "We will have 24/7 eyes now on those borders."
So what's interesting, Nikki, is presumably these conversations between one of our closest allies could have happened without the threat of a trade war. And as you know, Michigan is home to major car manufacturers. How has the auto industry been prepared to respond if these tariffs were to go in place? Because, as you pointed out, there's just a pause right now.
So, Vlad, just for some context, around 90% of auto exports to the U.S. come from Mexico and Canada. This bridge right here behind me, car parts are crossing all day long, all night long, all the time between Canada and the U.S. Many hubs here. General Motors actually has 3 plants in Canada. One of those plants is the worldwide exporter of V8 engines and dual clutch transmission. So critical here. One auto industry executive said that these tariffs would be detrimental to the auto industry, and some prices already, even with the pause on the tariffs of aluminum and steel, have been going up. One employee of a big auto part maker here in Detroit just told us right before we came on the air that they've been having a flurry of meetings this morning trying to sort of prepare for what might happen if these tariffs are ultimately imposed, the impact now with this pause. So a lot of questions, but certainly concern that tariffs could increase the prices for consumers and also potentially jeopardize some jobs here in Detroit in the auto industry.
Important context for us from Nikki Batiste reporting live in Detroit. Thank you, Nikki, as always, my friend. Appreciate it. Okay, search crews investigating the midair collision over Washington, D.C. are hoping to recover the cockpit of the jet involved as searches resume this morning. Salvage operations to remove the rest of the plane began yesterday. They had to pause several times as the remains of more victims were discovered and brought back for identification. The black boxes from both the Army helicopter and the plane have now been recovered. All right, want to share with you an incredible story out of Philadelphia. A 10-year-old boy is being hailed as a hero following that deadly plane crash that killed 7 people Friday in the city of brotherly love. So let me break it down for you. Andre Howard was in a car near the scene with his family. His father said the boy shouted, "Get down," and grabbed hold of his younger sister before the car's windows were shattered. Andre was seriously injured when a piece of shrapnel wound up lodged in his head. He survived emergency surgery. Doctors, his father told us, told him that Andre might not survive, but he did. He's doing well, he's stable, and he's being praised for his heroism. A fundraiser has been set up to help pay for Andre's medical expenses. Shout out to Andre. What a great story. Still ahead, Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth is bound to bring a surge of manpower to the southern border and says the administration's goal is to control the area. We're going to break down what it all means and the impact it will have. You're streaming CBS News 24/7. All right, we just want to tell you, folks, that we have some breaking news from Capitol Hill, that lawmakers have just voted to advance President Trump's pick for Health and Human Services Secretary, Robert F. Kennedy Jr. He had faced contentious hearings last week. He now appears to have received the number of votes that he needed to get out of committee to go now for a vote of the full Senate. Our Nicole Killian is there on Capitol Hill. You just heard us having a discussion about that. She's actually trying to wrangle Senator Bill Cassidy. We believe that the vote was 13-1, 14-13. So she's trying to wrangle Bill Cassidy there. And if she does, we're going to have that conversation for you live right here on CBS News 24/7. We also know that Tulsi Gabbard is up for same to get out of committee to go for a vote of the full Senate. Her nominating process has been a little bit more fraught with difficulty, given that there are even a number of Republican senators who are uncomfortable with the former Democratic Congresswoman, I should say, passed, what was that, Eric? Who are uncomfortable with some of her past positions, as specifically as it relates to Syria and to Russia. So we're going to keep watching that. And if Nicole wrangles Senator Cassidy, we'll have her right here on CBS News 24/7. Let's turn back now to the southern border. The Secretary of Defense, Pete Hegseth, made his first trip there. The trip is part of the Trump administration's show of force to tackle what President Trump called a national emergency. Here to tell us more about that trip is CBS News immigration and politics reporter Camilo Montoya Galvez. All right. So, Camilo, I just want to get some more clarity on what is happening at the southern border. You know that the president has put a pause on the tariffs that he sought to impose on Mexico and Canada. Mexico, he says, agreed to put 10,000 troops on the southern border and to continue to engage with best efforts to limit the number of migrants crossing into the United States. Can you describe what the situation on the ground was like before the president announced that this deal had been reached?
That's a critical question, Vlad, because we have to underscore that when President Trump took this action, illegal border crossings were already at a 4-year low. They plunged last year after reaching record highs in 2023 and 2022 under President Biden, mainly because of an increase in Mexican efforts to stop and delay migrants from reaching the U.S.-Mexico border in the first place. Mexican officials last year dramatically ramped up efforts, Vlad, to stop migrants from boarding buses and trains that would get them further into Mexico and closer to the American border. And of course, President Biden issued his own asylum crackdown in June of 2024 last year that essentially disqualified most migrants from asylum. Now, of course, President Trump has issued a more sweeping crackdown on asylum that essentially has shut down the asylum system and closed it down to most people who are crossing the border without proper documents. But that is really important to note that Mexico is already helping the U.S. in a very significant way to handle these very complex and vexing immigration challenges before President Trump threatened to impose tariffs on Mexico. And Canada as well was also helping the U.S. stem the flow of fentanyl and illegal crossings along the U.S.-Canada border, which we should also note pale in comparison to the sheer number of people who have been crossing the border and the sheer number of drugs intercepted at the southern border.
Right. So I'm trying to understand what the purpose of the Secretary of Defense, a cabinet level position, obviously making a show of appearing at the southern border. What message is that trying to send, and what the possibilities of what could come next with regards to our troops on the southern border might look like? As you know, and because you covered it, we had former Governor Kristi Noem, who's now the head of the Department of Homeland Security, also decked out in immigration cosplay during knockdown raids here in New York City, where they were going into apartment buildings in the Bronx as if they were in war-torn Afghanistan. I'm trying to understand what the performative nature of all that means and what it's trying to signal.
Well, look, Vlad, multiple things can be true at the same time. The Trump administration is indeed enlisting the vast resources and manpower of the U.S. military to aid in immigration and border enforcement. In some ways, that operational work is the same work that the military has been carrying out at the U.S.-Mexico border for a long time under Republican and Democratic presidents. That includes the administration of President Joe Biden, who also deployed troops to the border. And right now, many of those troops are doing the same operational tasks, like erecting border barriers to repel people from crossing into the U.S. illegally, and providing other operational and administrative assistance to Border Patrol, so Border Patrol agents, Vlad, can actually focus on their jobs of interdicting illicit drugs and migrants. But in some ways, what the military is doing now is unprecedented and new. And that includes that military planes now are being used to deport migrants to countries like Ecuador, Guatemala, Peru, Honduras, and now India. We saw the military send a deportation flight to India yesterday, according to U.S. officials. And so that work that the military is doing, Vlad, is changing and is helping the administration really fulfill this promise to, hopefully, in their eyes, oversee the largest deportation operation in American history.
So just for clarity, Camilo, they deported migrants from India back to India?
That's right, yes.
Okay. So yeah, as you rightly point out, that there has been an issue at the border with migrants crossing into the United States. It's become unprecedented. As you know, numerous presidents, Biden, when Trump was president the first time around, Barack Obama, George W. Bush, have all tried to tackle this issue. I guess the question going forward is, given that we're at a 4-year low of the number of migrants crossing into the country, how will things be different with these new tactics that the Secretary of Defense is suggesting?
That is such a critical question, because even though border crossings are at a 4-year low and migration has basically been brought to a standstill in most of the Western Hemisphere, including migration transit routes like the Darien Gap that divides Panama and Colombia, in the spring, historically, Vlad, we have seen a sharp increase in migration year over year as the weather gets warmer and as more migrants are able to travel to the U.S. border. So we should expect migration to increase at some point later in the year. The open question is whether the U.S. can continue to rely on Mexico to stop many of these migrants from getting here in the first place. And obviously, the administration is betting on, these threats of tariffs to do that exact work, to pressure Mexico to continue this work. Because again, if Mexico does not, the idea is that they will be penalized and punished.
Yeah, I could see that. I could see why the president would use that bully pulpit to accomplish that. All right, Camilo Montoya Galvez, thank you very much, my friend. Appreciate it. Always love having you on the show.
Thanks, Vlad.
All right, as we mentioned moments ago, lawmakers on Capitol Hill voted to advance President Trump's pick for Health and Human Services Secretary Robert F. Kennedy Jr. Let's get right to CBS News senior congressional correspondent Nicole Killion. So, Nicole Killion, break it down for us.
Yeah, well, basically what we saw is that the Senate Finance Committee has voted to advance the nomination of Robert F. Kennedy Jr. for Health and Human Services Secretary. That vote was strictly on party lines, 14-13, with Louisiana Republican Bill Cassidy voting in favor of RFK Jr.'s nomination. Of course, just a little while ago, we were on the air after just catching him where he told me he had made a decision, and now we see that decision was in support of Kennedy's nomination. Now, coming out of this committee meeting, we pressed the senator multiple times about why he decided to support Kennedy. He declined to comment, but said he does intend to make a statement on the Senate floor later this morning.
All right, Nicole Killion for us. Really interesting. It's right there in that statement. We appreciate your reporting. If you do get a chance to wrangle Senator Kennedy or any lawmaker for that matter, signal us, wave that hand, and we'll come right back to you. Thank you, Nicole, as always. There could be a potential purge at the FBI in the next few hours. Acting leadership faces the deadline of noon Eastern to hand over the names of agents and employees connected to the January 6th investigation to the Department of Justice. CBS News Justice correspondent Scott McFarland is live in Washington right now to tell us more about this deadline and what's supposed to happen, Scott. So just explain to our viewers how this is impacting headquarters in Washington, D.C. We know how it's impacting some of the field offices. You've reported on that. So what's to happen in the next couple of hours?
Just a day of turmoil inside the nation's foremost law enforcement agency. That's the simplest way to put it. It's the most straightforward way to view it. There are thousands of FBI employees who had some fingerprints on these January 6 cases because it was the largest criminal investigation in the FBI's history and involved more than 1,500 people being arrested. The names are being compiled into a list that is to be turned over as the afternoon begins here in Washington, turned over from the acting leadership at the FBI to the acting leadership at the Department of Justice. And the Department of Justice has made clear in the memos reviewed by CBS News, these names, these people could be in line for employment actions, which raises the possibility and raises fears there can be widespread resignations or widespread firings because these agents and these employees were part of the January 6 cases. And Vlad, you may be asking, well, what kind of misconduct would warrant firing or forced resignations? There really has been no misconduct found by the courts involving any investigator in January 6.
Wow. All right. What is your sense, Scott, from speaking to your sources about how the leadership of the FBI is complying with this or perhaps pushing back? I don't even know if they can push back, but what are you hearing?
The acting leadership of the FBI in there on a temporary basis after the former FBI director, Chris Wray, resigned, stood down, retired to a degree before Trump took office. The acting director has tried to soften some of this to his employees, to the rank and file, and some of the memos he's sent, reminding his employees there is a robust process, his word, robust process in place before employees can be terminated or disciplined, reminding them that there are protections for some of these civil servants. What's more, he has been arguing that he, too, is among the listed names that's going to be provided to the Department of Justice's leadership, softening the blow of all this. But there really is no avoiding the damage from this investigation, no matter if there are mass firings or not, Vlad. The fact that these agents have been investigated or that their names are going to be named for being part of January 6th sends a chilling message. Be careful the next case you take and make sure it does not displease President Trump.
I was having a conversation with somebody about exactly that, Scott, which is that this is setting the tone for what's to come at the agency and across all federal agencies. But could we potentially see FBI agents arrested? Or because, as you know, it's been reported by other news organizations that folks who received that letter saying that they had to resign their positions at certain federal agencies. In the case of one person who actually took the resignation, nothing has happened. So is this much ado about nothing other than the turmoil that you've described? Or could we see legal repercussions for people who do not comply?
The uncertainty is the problem right now. They don't know if there's going to be mass firings or none, and that's quite a difference. And they don't know which sense. They don't have a sense as to which one it's going to be. Here's a few things we do know. There's likely to be legal challenges from some of these FBI employees if there are mass terminations or forced resignations. Lawyers have already been lined up to represent some of these FBI employees. Expect this to go to court if the Department of Justice pulls the trigger. We also know that the FBI doesn't just investigate January 6th. So many of these agents are part of task forces that combat child sex trafficking, gun crimes, counterterrorism missions. There's an awful lot to be lost if agents are removed.
Fascinating and incredible. Scott McFarland for us. Thank you very much for your reporting, Scott. Appreciate it. All right, much more news ahead. We'll be right back. You're streaming CBS News 24/7. All right, back to one of our top stories this morning. China announced some retaliatory tariffs on some U.S. imports and opened an antitrust investigation into Google as Beijing hits back at President Trump's new tariffs. CBS News correspondent Anna Corin is following the very latest from Hong Kong.
President Trump has delivered on his threat, firing what he calls the opening salvo in the new trade war with China, enforcing 10% tariffs on all Chinese goods imported into the United States. Now, this was widely anticipated and drew an immediate response from the Chinese government, which hit back with retaliatory tariffs on a more limited range of products, including natural gas, oil and farm machinery, coming into effect on the 10th of February. As part of its response, the Chinese government also restricted the export of critical minerals, including tungsten, predominantly used in the production of military hardware. American company PVH, the owner of brands Calvin Klein and Tommy Hilfiger, has been blacklisted because of its stance on Xinjiang cotton, along with biotechnology company Illumina. Well, separately, China also took aim at Google, launching an antitrust investigation. Now, President Trump and Chinese President Xi Jinping will speak in the coming days, which means the situation could drastically change as it did with Canada and Mexico. Earlier, I spoke to Dr. Henry Wang, an advisor to the Chinese government, who believes the fact the two leaders are due to talk is a good sign, stressing that Beijing is open to dialogue and wants to maintain a working relationship between the world's two largest economies. Now, Trump has accused China of not doing enough to stem the flow of fentanyl into the United States and says these tariffs are a direct response to that. However, many analysts believe that this is just the start of a negotiation with a China that this time round is far better prepared. Back to you.
All right, Anna Corn, thank you very much. All right, let's bring in CBS News Philadelphia meteorologist Grant Gilmore with the last look at the national forecast.
I'll say it while I have time. Go Birds, right? Hey, let's look across the country. Atmospheric river continuing to hit the west coast from the Pacific Northwest all the way into central and southern California by the time we get into tomorrow. But today, a lot of warmth across the south. Look at Houston, around 79 degrees today. A lot of snow in the Sierra Nevada. Some places could pick up close to 5 feet of snow. Meanwhile, a developing storm system will track east through the Midwest into the Northeast. We're talking ice, snow, and rain in areas south as we go into Wednesday through Thursday. And then after that, more warmth across the south. Look at that, 80s in places from Oklahoma into Texas. Vlad, back to you.
Thank you very much, my friend. Go Eagles for you, not for me. That does it for me here, though. But stay right where you are. After the break, Elizabeth Cook is live from San Fran with all the breaking news coast to coast. This is CBS News 24/7.